Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. In today's episode, I take another fascinating foray into my quest to uncover the wealth of Australian literary talent. Anna Roma is the author of 4 books published by Simon Schuster. A self-confessed hermit, Anna enjoys writing stories which evoke our unique landscape, dark family secrets, old rambling houses and characters who are haunted by their past. Her latest book, Under the Midnight Sky, ticked all these boxes. A beautiful tale that explores the underbelly of trauma and grief in a unique and evocative tale that sank its hooks into me from the opening pages. If you haven't picked up one of Anna's books yet, I highly recommend this one. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Anna to the podcast today. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks so much for having me.
Anna, this book had all the feels for me. A strong main character who unapologetically follows her gut instincts to uncover the truth, a dual timeline giving us a glimpse into a bygone era, a mystery, a love story, small town bigotry, the lot really. So I wanted to ask you, how did you come to write this story?
A story always, for me anyway, is always the culmination of experiences, things that I'm exposed to, like books or films or ideas that I'm reading about, all sorts of things. But I think really the heart of this story came to me after a relationship I had with a really, really wonderful man who was battling some very dark demons. And when the relationship broke down, I was really torn between feeling that I had a responsibility to continue the relationship for his mental health or look out for my own safety. He had quite severe manic attacks and I was growing increasingly aware of my own vulnerability in the situation. So that was a lot of soul searching after that. And I think the idea for the story came from the idea that if you're in this sort of relationship, how trapped you can feel. And you're not just trapped. I wasn't trapped physically, but the trap for me was an emotional one. Not just emotional because of my esteem for him, but emotional in that I felt a kind of responsibility to do the right thing, which in my mind was to find a way to help him. Then, of course, my sense of survival kicked in and I thought, I've got to bail. When I was starting out to write this story, that was very fresh in my mind. And so I started playing around with those sort of ideas of entrapment, and not just the entrapment of your physical body, but the entrapment of your spirit. That was really where the heart of the story was born for me.
So for listeners who haven't read this book yet, Anna, can you tell me a little bit more about the story?
The story is about a woman, Abby. She's a journalist and she has a very difficult childhood. Her mother leaves the family when she's about 12 and her father has always turned to drink and has his own sort of things going on. When she's about 12, she has an experience where she is lost in the bush for 3 days. She's actually abducted, and so she is always haunted by this feeling that there's unfinished business that's niggling in the back of her mind. And so she returns to her hometown of Gundara, which is in northern New South Wales. So she comes back and she goes jogging every morning. One morning she finds an unconscious teenager and she goes to the main road for help. And when she comes back, the girl is gone. So the story is really about Abby's quest to find out what happened to this girl. And as things start unraveling in the story, she starts to realise that there is something connecting what happened to her as a child and this young girl that's gone missing in the present day. So the story is really about her following these threads, and also at the same time she's trying to find the girl, find out what happened to the girl. She's also delving into her own past and having to confront things that she hasn't confronted until now, in the hopes that it will shed light on finding this girl.
Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, the book has a dual timeline. One part of the story takes place in the late 1940s, early 1950s, along with the contemporary storyline being Abby's story. So I wanted to ask you, what kind of research was involved in writing this book?
The research was mostly to do with the historical timeline, which is set in the 1940s, actually from 1948, I think it was, 1947, 48 into the early 50s. So most of my research was to do with just, it wasn't even anything really momentous like world wars or anything like that, which I've done in previous books. This was more day-to-day research. So one of the people I sort of interviewed was my mum. One of the questions I asked her was, what did you use for toilet paper? It was more things like that, like very day-to-day workings of life back in the 1940s. Other things I did were following a thread in the story, crimes committed in the early 50s and corporal punishment, that sort of thing. So I found some very interesting bits and pieces to do with that. So the research was very focused. There was quite a bit of it, mostly to do with day-to-day workings of this certain situation and reading police reports written in the 1940s, that sort of thing.
Now, you describe Ravensong, the house which is at the centre of the story, in such vivid detail. So I wanted to know, was it based on a real-life house, someplace perhaps that you'd visited before?
It's kind of a mishmash of properties that I've lived in or ones that I've visited, places I've perhaps just explored, and it is really clear in my mind. So it almost feels as though I did actually live in that house.
I love that.
I know, that's how clear it is in my mind, but I'm pretty sure I didn't. When I lived in a remote place in the bush, it was nothing like that. It was just really a bit of a shack. Maybe I dreamt of living somewhere like this. When I write about these houses, I think they're from houses that I've just seen along the way in my travels and admired and absorbed, and that's how I'm able to visualise them so clearly.
So when I was reading this book, I was reminded of the Blue Mountains, an area which sits an hour or so to the west of Sydney, but your fictional town of Gandara was much farther away. So you said it was in northern New South Wales.
Yes, it was based on the city of Armidale. So that's it's a really, I lived in the area for many years, and it's a really beautiful area. It has, even though northern New South Wales, most people think of it as, it's very hot and parts of it are very tropical. But the Armidale region, the New England region of northern New South Wales, has 4 distinct seasons, and it can be one of the coldest areas in Australia. During winter, it gets very hot, dry summers. So I really loved the climate, and I suppose because of my familiarity with having lived there and spent so much time in the bush, in remote areas there, I have a real connection to the bush out there. So I always seem to gravitate back to the area when it comes to doing a setting. I always have these ideas like, I'm going to travel somewhere glamorous and amazing, and everyone's going to be just thrilled that I've come up with somewhere new to set a story. But as the story progresses, it kind of takes me down this road back to that area. So I don't know what it is. It just, it's kind of my heartland in a way, that area, and all my stories kind of lead me back there.
Kind of leads into my next question, which is, what I felt was that you'd captured the essence of modern small towns really, really well in this book. So many of these small towns rely on the tourist dollar for economic survival. And in your book, Abby is warned off writing a particular story that she wants to write because it might scare the tourists away. This is such a recurring theme in modern Australian literature, isn't it? Something that we've been reminded of in the recent bushfire crisis.
Yes, definitely. Somewhere like Armidale has the university, and it's a large town in, well, a city really, in a big farming community. So everybody in all the smaller towns around it will often go to Armidale for the hospital or the university or for shopping, things that they can't buy locally. So it's a real hub. When I set the story there, probably in the last 10 or so years, the area has been struggling a bit. So every time you go to Armidale, there are shops closed down and vacant shops. And one of the last times I was there, I was walking along the street, and I think it was a Friday morning, which is the same time of day that there's a scene where Abby walks along the street, and she has my experience of looking around and saying, well, it's a Friday morning, this should be really a thriving street, but there's no one around. And you could see that the town was really struggling, which meant that if this hub was struggling, then some of the other smaller towns surrounding it, they would be struggling probably. You spoke of the bushfires. I think that will definitely affect people, because I think it affects people's morale. And, the news moves on to something new, but those people that have been affected by the bushfires, even the ones who lived in lived in towns where someone might have lost their house, or things like that happened, I think people are traumatised. To be traumatised on so many levels is a really hard thing to sort of get about and say, all right, we're going to get back to work, we're going to go, and people are going to come back, the business is going to come back. I think people's spirits are really can be very deflated by something as traumatic as a bushfire, and especially the ones that we've just been through. I don't think most of us have really seen anything like that before.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Stockholm Syndrome. Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers here, but it's a fascinating premise, and I wonder if you deliberately chose to explore this subject and why.
Yes, I did. I did choose to explore it, and the reason why harks back to my teenage years when I saw a film called Badlands, and I'm relying on my unreliable memory here, Claudine, but was Sissy Spacek and Martin Sheen, and they were both very, very young, and it was a very gritty sort of film. And in that film, I don't remember the exact scenario, just that it was that situation where she was held at first against her will, and then a kind of relationship grew between them. And it was kind of that thing that I was talking about before, where you have this kind of entrapment. You're allowing yourself, or you're kind of trapped against your will, but it's not really against your will. And I think that got me thinking, this film got me thinking at a young age about this phenomenon. And I looked into it more and discovered it was actually a thing, and it's called Stockholm Syndrome, where a person is taken against their will, and because of the way their captor is, the things they tell them, they can brainwash them. They can say, you wouldn't survive out there without me, you need me. The captor works on the belief system of the person they're holding, and after a while, even somebody with the strongest will start to question their own beliefs. So that's really how it comes about, I think. And I did a fair bit of research, just kind of refamiliarising myself with this idea, because in the story, the girls who experience this come from a background where they weren't really paid very much attention to, and their mother was preoccupied with her own problems, and these girls were basically neglected. And so when they were kidnapped, the kidnapper, he was very attentive to them. He was kind of like an older brother to them. What I was exploring was, what if somebody had quite good reason to, if someone paid them a lot of attention and made them feel safe, that they've never really had those, never really felt all that safe before. And what if they're in this situation against their will and kind of given a whole new set of beliefs to think about? And this is in a way what happened in the story. And that was what I was exploring, that the idea of Stockholm syndrome.
As I mentioned in my introduction, I believe this book exposes the underbelly of trauma in a very unique way. In particular, and I was delighted to see this, that you had a quote from Khalil Gibran, which appears in the front pages of your novel. And it appears to me, and you might think something differently, but it appears to me that this strikes at the very heart of your story. So the quote goes, "I am the flame and I am the dry bush, and one part of me consumes the other." I'm such a huge fan of Khalil Gibran's work, but I've never come across this. So I wanted to ask you, why was it important to quote this phrase and to address trauma and its effects in this way?
That's a really great question. I love Khalil Gibran as well, and I've used another of his quotes. I think it was Thornwood House, and I always seem to find something within his amazing work that just speaks to me about what I'm trying to say. And I know this will sound crazy, but even though I'm a writer, I do feel as though I really struggle with, I have an abstract thought in the back of my mind, and I often really struggle with articulating it. When I go to someone like Khalil Gibran, or Rumi is another amazing poet, they just have this ability to sum up so much. And I think this quote, when I saw it, I kind of had that goosebump moment where I thought, this really sums up the whole thing, because it was about, it is exactly as you said, one part of what's inside you consumes the other part and it takes it over. And sometimes you don't even know you're doing it. Sometimes you sabotage yourself, or you destroy something good in your life. You act out something that is not true to you. You allow people to say something, or you allow yourself to say something or do something that is not, it's not true to your own beliefs. And I think there is a part of us that does self-sabotage. And I think addressing trauma in this way, people that have experienced trauma, it's so messy inside, and it's so hard for me to put things into words, ideas that I have. How much harder is that for someone who has experienced great trauma, like, for example, the characters that I'm writing about in this book? They've experienced this trauma, but not always able to articulate it or even come to terms with it in their own mind. And so the quote was, yes, it was kind of like it's like I wrote the story, and I think about halfway through I found the quote, and in finding the quote I found the heart of what I was trying to say.
So Anna, I wanted to ask you, what would you like most for people to take away from this novel?
I never set out to write a story that's going to sort of change anything in the world. When I start writing, I usually set out trying to solve a dilemma or a problem that I have in my own mind. So this idea about entrapment, to me, that was like going on a bit of a quest to discover, why does this fascinate me, and how can I find a story that, to me, sheds a little bit more light on all these ideas and questions and things I've got going on in my mind. So really, my whole goal of writing the story is just so that somebody can come along and pick it up and they'll have a really great read. And, you know, when you pick up a book and you get hooked into it and you get gripped and you carry along in the story and you think you're absolutely there and it's just so enjoyable. And then you come out the other side and you go, wow, I've been on that journey myself. So I don't really set out to change the world or change anybody's mind about anything. Maybe just take them on a bit of a journey, you know, a bit of a trip, having an experience that's enjoyable and immersing them in this world for a while. If something comes out of it where they have an insight or they have a deeper understanding of perhaps some of their own questions, that's a bonus.
Well, I certainly went on a journey in this book and I absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
So moving away from the book for a little bit, there are a lot of aspiring writers that listen to this podcast. So I wanted to ask you, Anna, are you a plotter or a pantser?
That is the question, Claudine, that I ask myself nearly every day. When I started writing, I thought I kind of did a lot of research into the process. I wasn't one of these natural writers who, just climb on the horse and ride myself off into the sunset. I had to feel like I'd write something and I think, well, that was really great fun, but it's terrible claptrap. So how do I get something that I can look at and think it's kind of half decent or, expresses what I'm trying to express? So I did a lot of research into it and I found a lot of evidence saying that if you plot a story, then you save time, you don't end up waffling on for 100 years about something totally unrelated, which I tend to do. So I thought, yeah, that's for me. I'm going to be a plotter. And so I would plot these stories to within an inch of their lives, and then I'd go about writing it and totally forget about the plot, go off on tangents, and then halfway through I'd go, well, this is an unholy mess. What am I supposed to do now? Oh, the plot. I'd go back to the plot. It'd be totally different. So I'd have to replot. And after a while, I found myself spending more time plotting than I was actually writing my story. And that was really quite a frustrating thing. And when you have a book out, there's also, when you're doing the next book, there's a deadline and, you've got to be aware constantly of the deadlines. It was kind of working for me, but it was working in a way that was really, really unproductive and really quite distressing for me because I'd constantly be second guessing myself, going back to the start, rewriting. So with this book, Under the Midnight Sky, unfortunately, kind of went through a similar thing where I wrote constantly for about 12 months, which there's so many authors out there, wonderful authors who can put out a book in that time and have it published and then move on to the next one. But here's me scratching my head, looking at my plot, looking at what I've written, thinking, something's just not working. Really had to start questioning my technique. And so in the end, what I found was if I started with a kind of working synopsis, what I mean by working is that I just write a half a page that gives me an idea about where I'm going to start heading. And then I write the story and then I think, okay, I'm a bit unclear about where I go next. So I go back to this. The current story that I'm working on is going a lot better because I'm allowing myself not to work from a plot, because I find with a plot, I was just looking at the surface of the story. When you write that way, you hit all these blocks that you just can't get past, or I do anyway sometimes. So I'm taking a different approach with this story that I'm working on now, which is to say, sure, she has a goal and she's got a misbelief stopping her from kind of pushing through and reaching that goal. And I'll ask myself, all right, well, this is where she is now. How is her misbelief, or how is the situation she's created by believing such a thing? What's the situation that she's kind of got herself into by believing this thing about herself or about the world in general? How has that created a roadblock for her? So rather than me looking at my plot and saying, oh, what happens next is this scenario, having a kind of plan ahead, I just let the story sort of unravel a bit and I'll write it down, and that's great fun. And then I'll go back to that kernel of an idea that I had at the start and use that to propel me where she goes next. And I think for me, it's never really one or the other. It's never wholly plot, or it's never wholly just letting myself go. But finding, and I think for most writers it's the same, it's finding the point where you're comfortable with how much of one and how much of the other, so how much of plotting and how much of pantsing you're doing. And I think after 4 books, finally I'm coming to the realisation, perhaps a little bit late, that it's slightly more towards the pantsing side, but with a fairly strong outline to go back to if I need it.
The reality is that, you know, as varied as there are the number of writers in the world, everybody has a different way that works for them.
I really did love the idea of being a plotter, but the challenge for me was just I would plot it all out, and then I'd say to myself, well, I try to write it, and I say to myself, well, what's the point? Because I already kind of know what's supposed to happen. It would get a little bit boring for me. And I just found I wanted to give myself freedom. But I think for everybody, they have to find, that medium ground that is best for them.
So, Anna, what would be your top 3 tips for writers out there looking to write or to get their first book published?
Just have that kind of thing going on with where the internal conflict of your character sort of drives the story. Secondly, I would say that whenever you're writing and you get stuck, is to go back to the ideas that started you off writing this story in the first place. So what was the original inspiration? What is it about the story that captures your imagination? What is it about the story that compelled you in such a strong way to commit to writing it? And it could be something like, with me, this idea about entrapment and all the different ways, and, why do you allow yourself to sort of be entrapped? So go back to the real basics of where the story began, and then start asking, why does she want this? And then just keep asking why. So that always helps me if I'm getting stuck. It always helps me to clarify where I can go next, and gives me deeper insight into what the character's motives are, that sort of things. Just going back to the basics, even things like what your character wants and why she's in the story, and asking why. The third tip, and this kind of overrules every other tip in the world as far as I'm concerned, is when you're writing, allow yourself to just sink into the enjoyment of what you're doing. Just really don't worry about if you've got a deadline and you think, oh, I've got to write really fast because I've got this deadline coming up or whatever. The most important ingredient in absolutely anything in the world, baking a cake, having a relationship, raising animals or children or anything else in the world, the secret ingredient is love. And I really believe that when you're writing a book, you're writing for love, because it's really hard, and the whole thing is hard. Even once you get published, you think, oh, great, now I can relax. Oh no, there are so many challenges, and you're putting your heart out there, and then you'll get reviews, and you think, ouch. Yeah. That's the whole thing is really it's really quite hard, and the only thing that makes it all worthwhile is if you're loving what you do. It's if you're enjoying the process of doing it. Follow that line of your own intrigue into the story and enjoy it. Sometimes you'll be writing slow, enjoying the process. Sometimes you'll be writing fast with purpose. But if you're ever writing something and you're thinking, oh, this is a real grind, it's a slog and I'm just not enjoying it, I always use that as a red flag to say, if I'm not enjoying writing this scene, does this scene really belong in my story? Because if I'm not enjoying writing it, if I'm finding it confusing or hard, then I have to question whether that scene is worth being in the story.
So finally, Anna, if people wanted to learn more about you and your books, how can they find you?
My website is annaroma.com.au, and I'm also on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook very much, but my lovely sister gets on there because I'm not a big kind of social media person, being a hermit and all. If people want to contact me on Facebook, eventually it will get back to me. So,
Anna, I wanted to thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today. I know listeners are going to love Under the Midnight Sky as much as I did. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Claudine. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.